Welcome back for Chapter 2 of our making of an FPS in Unity. In this chapter, we're going to get the player to have some weapons. On screen, you can see what we're going to do in this video. We're going to create a projectile. Now, I'm creating the projectile first because I feel like it's a little anticlimactic to have a weapon, and then when you try to fire it, it does nothing. So we're going to get the projectile set up first, and then in the next video, we're going to actually have the weapon appear on the camera, and we'll be able to shoot that projectile. So we left off with our world, and all of that's fine and well. It doesn't matter where we start in the world to work on this. So pick any start position, doesn't really matter. So we are going to need to import some new assets for this, and those assets will be linked in the video description. So these assets come from, and these are freely available. These are Unity's tutorial on making an FPS. So the only thing that I've done differently with these is I've stripped out all of the scripts. Because in their project, the assets are very tightly woven with a bunch of scripts into how they set up an FPS, and I just want the models. So really, you could do this with any models. There's nothing, like I'm just using them as models. So there's no reason you have to use this. So when you import them, they come in with the packages FPS weapons, and in their free kit, they have 3 weapons that we're going to use. They have this blaster-looking thing that we're going to use first. Now, you can see from the gizmos that it's already rigged up with some kind of particle effects. We may not end up playing around with all of those. Maybe we could. So, like, you can see that like the individual cylinders here are actually set up for you to be able to like pop them out and animate them. And like I said, in the original Unity script, they have that. But we just want to use it as a basic model. And so that's what we're going to start it with, which is going to be a model for us to spawn lasers from. There's a thing that we're going to use as a grenade launcher, or rocket launcher, it depends on how we want to do it. And then a shotgun weapon. So these 3 weapons are going to teach us the basics of all we need to know for weapon design. We are going to have a projectile weapon that shoots a kind of fast-moving laser projectile. We're going to do a hit scan shotgun effect, and we're going to do an area effect rocket launcher. And from that, you should be able to kind of extrapolate different ways of doing weapons. But what matters most to us right now is the projectiles set of the prefabs. So if you're using your own assets, if you're finding some off the asset store or just downloading them, right now we need projectiles. So you could even do this with a box. You don't have to have a fancy looking little laser. All right, so we need to start building this to be a projectile. And unfortunately, that's going to start us with coding. So let's go into the scripts folder, and we're going to create a new folder of scripts. And I'm going to call this projectiles. So this is going to govern all of our projectile-related stuff. And I'm going to start with a interface. So it's going to be called iProjectile. And this is just so I can at least start setting up the infrastructure for projectiles to have a unified set of methods to retrieve their damage, to signal they hit something, so that if these projectiles need to be interacted with the world, they have a uniform set of methods to do so with. So open up iProjectile. And we're going to change this from a class to an interface. and it's not going to inherit from mono behavior. Remember, an interface is basically an abstract class. I don't want to use abstract classes because we're already inheriting from mono behavior, and I'm pretty sure you can't have multiple inheritance, and if you can, you really shouldn't. So it's an interface. It's an abstract class. It guarantees the existence of these methods in any class that implements this interface. So we're going to have a method called getOwner. We're going to have a method called getDamage. And we're going to have a method called impact. Now, I do actually plan on setting most of the damage dealing on the projectiles, but as I'm coding, if I decide that I want the projectiles, if I want the enemies to handle receiving damage, this will be incredibly useful. And that's all this interface needs. We'll probably tweak it later, but for now, this is fine. So it's going back to Unity. And we're going to make a new script here. So we're going to right-click, create a C# script. This is going to be called Projectile _ player _ blaster. Kind of mixing styles here. It's a little bit of a Python-esque naming convention here. I'm naming it this way pretty much like we did with the objects to indicate the classification of this script, that this is a projectile script, this is for players, and this is the blaster script. So it's just really a way for me to organize the name of the script. So inside of here, let's first tell it to inherit from the interface by just putting iProjectile. And that will make us so that we have to implement the required methods. And we'll come to those in a second. So now we need some variables. I guess let's make these private. So we have private string owner, private float speed. Let's initialize them just to be on the safe side. Private float damage. So these are the weapon data. Now, other things that we might need are Unity settings. So that would be, we need our rigid body. And eventually we're going to put in a like a particle explosion when it hits something. So the question is, do I want to assign that in the projectile or want to assign it in the weapon? I'll assign it here. And so this will eventually be a prefab of some kind of hit effect, some kind of particle explosion. All right, and I guess if we really want to put a tooltip on it, so this is the hit effects that we'll play. So at least there's some kind of tooltip. I do want to jump over to iPrefab real quick and set up one more method. Public void initialize, and it's going to have inputs of a float speed, float damage, and a, what was that last property? Owner. So string owner. And the idea is that this method is going to allow us to set up those variables that were private initially. I kind of feel like string should probably come first. I'm thinking like in most importance of data. So who owns the projectile, how fast the projectile, how much does it hit for? So when I go back over to here, it's going to be mad because I need to go implement that method real quick. And so now it added my initialize method here. So the initialize method is pretty much our standard fare for, it's kind of like a constructor, except for we don't really get to use constructors when we're creating objects in Unity like this, because it's kind of already existing, kind of. But this is basically behaving as a constructor would. As you can see from the lines of code here, we'll call this our fake constructor. So with those set up, we can at least clean some of this up. So get damage will return damage. Get owner will return owner. And impact doesn't need to do anything right now, but if we want to, we could call destroy this.gameObject. So impact is the method that we're going to use to basically kill off our laser. So the start method, I'm trying to think if I want start or awake. We'll do start. We do want to bind our rigid body. And then set the initial speed. So the velocity is going to equal the transform forward vector times speed. And so speed is effectively going to be like a units per second measure. That's how velocity tends to work out. So knowing that we just set the velocity like this, we have to be careful to make sure that this laser will not have any drag when we add the rigid body component, because there's no force acting on this. So we essentially want it to be frictionless. And update is right now not needed, so I'm going to take it out. And we'll have private void on collision enter. Make sure that you spell it correct, because if you misspell this, it won't trigger. And actually, I want to make sure that it is. So on collision. Okay. And we'll just call my impact method. We'll keep it kind of consistent. So when it hits a collider, it's going to run impact, which will just destroy it. And eventually we'll spawn the hit particles and all that stuff. But for now, we just want to destroy the laser. Okay, so we can minimize this, and now we can spend a little bit of time playing with the laser to make it look good. So first up, let's just throw one in the world and see what happens. Oop. I think I clicked the wrong button there. So I know that my player is going to spawn right here. So maybe I want to put a laser projectile just kind of chilling in the world. So facing it in a direction I can watch it. So when I hit play, this glowing beam of laser is just hanging out right there. So first thing that I'm noticing is I might want to shrink it up a little bit. It is kind of long. Like the tail is really cool, but I do think it is a bit long, so I'm dropping it to a size of 4. And I think, again, that is kind of on the long side, but it's probably fine. So we're going to attach the script. So I'm going to attach the player, the projectile player blaster to the parent of this prefab. So we have our script here. We don't have the hit effects yet, but we do need to set up a few things. It needs a rigid body. So we're going to go to Physics Component Rigid Body. Angular drag, it doesn't rotate, so it's fine. And drag is 0, that's actually very important. Use gravity, we want to be unchecked. And then expand out layer overrides, and we want it to exclude the player because we don't want the player to count as hitting it in terms of collisions. This is the player's weapon, so we don't want the player's weapon to accidentally count as hitting themselves. The collision detection, we will go with continuous. Now, you can read up more about the collision detection, but what the collision detection is really useful for is determining hits for fast-moving objects. And this projectile does have the capacity to go reasonably quick. So if it's moving so fast that it's effectively teleporting in between frames, you might not have a collision happen because it's moving so fast it, like, quote, teleports through whatever thing it was supposed to hit. So if we use this continuous collision detection, it should be more likely to impact. And then we'll interpolate. I want to say this would be an exterpolate. Well, let's interpolate for now. Notice I didn't exclude the player yet because I want to be able to jump on this laser and see if I can get it to delete itself. And then we need a collider so it can acknowledge that it's hitting something. So I'm going to add a capsule collider. I'm going to center it on the Z-axis. And I'm going to scrub the Z up a little bit. Now, I don't want the whole thing to register as a hitbox. I only really want the head of it to register as a hitbox. So I'm moving it up there, shrinking it down a little bit, maybe dropping this to 0.4. And so that is what considers the hit for this laser. You don't want to make it too small. I might go with 0.3 because if it's too small, it might just like never hit anything. But you do want some level of realistic, like you actually missed or you hit. So you don't want it too big. If you're feeling brave, you can go to 2. So if we hit play, it has the script attached to it. And, ooh, it's currently solid. Let's switch it to a trigger. Now that might mean I need to change this from on collision enter to on trigger enter. Although, I don't think that's the case. Well, so it happens. So it caused it to delete. Now, as a trigger, so by changing this to a trigger, it doesn't have solidness anymore. And then so on trigger enter will reference whenever another collider, whether that collider is a trigger or non-trigger, passes through it, we're going to trigger impact. So other triggers could proc this. Solid things can proc this. But whereas on collision enter, I believe is 2 solid triggers. So if we take that out, we're now running off of on trigger enter. So that basically registered as hitting the player. Now, a few other experiments that we can run with with it. Not a whole lot we can do until we can actually start shooting them. You could plant one, like, because I know the trees have colliders. So if your trees have colliders too, you could stick it into the tree like this so that it's inside the tree and it's registering a hit. And it should just immediately disappear. As you can see, it just immediately disappeared there. All right. And the last test, I just want to make sure it counts for hitting the ground. So it should also immediately disappear now because it's hitting the ground. And it did. So overall, pretty happy with it. Let's make sure it moves. So the next thing I want to do is I'm just going to give it a speed for testing purposes. Now it's a private variable, so I can just pull up the script and edit it. If this were a public variable, it doesn't really let you do that. Because remember, if these are public variables, the only way you can change them initially is by actually just editing them in the Unity inspector. And so it travels. So it looks pretty good. Now, I do want to tweak it a little bit and give it some kind of personality and particle effect. So this is kind of the second part where we take a look at building a particle material and using the particle emitter. So this I also specifically did not include as part of the package, so that we have to learn how to do this ourselves, because this is honestly a pretty important skill. So we have, so if you go to that link that includes the assets, there's going to be a folder of sprites. This will probably be a zip when you go to the assets, but then you'll have to unzip it onto your desktop, but mine's already unzipped. This doesn't work if it's zipped. If you try to drag and drop and it doesn't, like it just, so like notice how when I drag and drop, it turns into a plus sign. If you're not getting that, you might not have it unzipped. So I want to take these, and I'm just going to take this entire folder and drag and drop it into packages for now. So this is how you can bring in your own graphics into a project. You don't have to just use Unity packages. We can just drag and drop things. But there's a few things to keep in mind. When these come in, so these are all particle effects that I want to use. They aren't materials, and they may or may not have the right texture type assigned to it. So we're going to have to go play with that to make sure that we end up setting it to something that we want. So let's start by creating some materials, because the particle emitter will not work with these as just flat textures. It wants them as a material. So I am going to create a new folder here under assets, kind of my core root folder, called materials. And I'm going to start with a new material. And I'm going to call this mat underscore projectile underscore blaster. So this is, oh, I guess I should be more specific. Blaster spark. So this is a spark for the blaster. I'm just trying to be specific with the naming because I might end up with a lot of materials depending on what I end up doing. So now I would want to pick so while this is in my inspector, I would pick one of these, and these are also publicly available sprites. These are from the sprite artist Kenny EY. He is somebody who makes a lot of sprites, makes a ton of graphics. So if you've Googled sprite sheets or free game development resources, you've probably come across this website. So I kind of want some kind of like little effect. So I like star 4. I shouldn't have clicked on that. So let me go back to my material, click on my material, go back to here, and I'm going to drag and drop star 4 into this square right next to base map. And what that's going to do is that's going to assign this as the texture's base. So it's going to be kind of hard to see any of the other adjustments until we end up actually like testing it and seeing what it looks like. Although there is a few things that I want to do. So these particle effects are not currently like they're not transparencied. As you can see, they're black and white, which is the style for these type of decals. So I want to tell Unity to expect the transparency to come from the grayscale. And then I don't think I need to change any of these other ones. Now we could do alpha is transparency. I don't think we need to for this quite yet. So I'm going to hit apply. And if we turn on alpha is transparency, it does switch to being transparent like that. But I guess we can roll with that. So check alpha is transparency. So with this setup, my material now should be good to go. So let's go to my laser, or my projectile. And I want to have this thing emit particles as it flies through the air. So I'm going to give it a particle emitter. So with the parent object selected, I'm just going to go to Components, Effects, Particle System. That's not what we want. So lots of settings inside the particle system. So first up, I don't need these durations to be very high, so I can just do 1 for now. Start speed is actually going to be 0, because I want these to just fall as the thing flies through the air. So that also means I want to give them gravity. So the gravity modifier, I'll go with 0.2. But this looks pretty hideous right now because they're just boxes. So let's give it the material. So if we jump down to renderer, we can see that there's a slot here for material. And that's where we actually want to take this material that we just made and paste it into there. Now you'll notice that this is not what we want. So we actually want to change this material type. It is not a texture right now. It shouldn't have the universal lit thing here. We actually want it to be a particle, unlit particle, so lighting doesn't affect this particle. And then the rendering mode is transparent. Now, you can get kind of funky with some additive and subtractive, but I'm just going to go transparent. And I'm going to leave it white because if I reuse it for other things, I can adjust the color elsewhere. So if I go back to here, well, that's a little bit closer to what I want, but I really want them to be falling from the middle of this. So I'm going to go down to emission, and under emission, not emission, shape, I don't want a cone. I actually want a box. And you can see that there's this light blue box now. And I'm going to shrink the X. Well, I'm going to move the Z up so it kind of comes from here. I'm going to shrink the Z to maybe like 0.6. And the X and Y to maybe 0.2. So you can kind of see that these are just falling from the laser itself. Let's see, let's make these a little bit smaller. So start size instead of 1, I'm just going to do 2. Do they look better as 3D objects? I think they might. No. I'm just seeing if any of these look better. That might not look bad using 3D rotation. I think it kind of looks the same. So, all right, so they look good right now. Simulation space should be world because I want them to kind of just fall from this laser. And then I'm going to do color over lifetime. I'm going to check the box, expand this, click on that. And now I can adjust the color. So on the bottom is the color that they are. So if I want them to be this kind of yellowish thing. And right now I've only set this, so it's going to transition out to white. And what I could do is have them fade into, on the top is the alpha setting. So they can fade out over time. So that the idea is that they will fade away. And then maybe size over lifetime. So that, and then I'm going to adjust this curve so that they start big, but get small. Now if I go and hit play and look at it, well, you can barely see it. I mean, there's that jump of lag when the thing starts. So there is a trail of particles. We'll see it more in the next video when we're actually spawning this. But that's something that could be fun to play with. There's other settings that might be worth looking at, and I'm just going to leave it for now. The very last thing I want to do is build a very quick thing for an impact so that when this hits something, we can have some particles emit out of it. Well, we might save that for the next video. This is already about 30 minutes, so we'll get the laser to shoot because I think that might be more rewarding once we can actually shoot the laser at something and then see these particles appear. Otherwise, it'd be really hard for us to test this. So we'll do that in the next video. So we'll stop here. We've got a projectile that's ready to be spawned by my weapon. So in the next video, we're gonna get a weapon in there and actually set up all of the trimmings to make this look nice. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.